I'm Daniel Tatarzyn. I'm a professor of developmental English at Lone Star College, Kingwood. This is
Stephanie Kelly, professor of history at Kingwood.
We're going to talk to you today about something we did with our two courses. As you can see, Oppression and the Art of Resistance, a thematic approach to teaching political agency. So this was a course that we designed and implemented last spring, and we're planning to do again this spring. But it's a learning community, so it takes students are enrolled in both courses, and they run back-to-back, and both instructors are in each class kind of participating as well. The goal with this course was to get students to kind of analyze power dynamics in society and look at specifically kind of dominant and subordinate groups, the oppressed and the oppressors, and to kind of analyze the means of oppression, forms oppression takes, and the different means and methods that the oppressed group uses to resist that oppression. And so we're hoping to kind of get them thinking critically and analyzing these power dynamics that play such a role in our society, and especially in aspects of inequality, economic inequality, but also all other forms of inequality are kind of tied into that. And so we kind of take the approach of basing it on James C. Scott's work, Domination and the Arts of Resistance, which looks at these dominant and subordinate groups, and the idea of hidden and public transcripts, which Dr. Kelly will explain to you in a little bit. But we're kind of hoping that this will allow students to see that the inequality and economic inequality isn't something that's kind of naturally occurring and fundamental, but it's something that has been created by the exercise of power by dominant groups and dominant forces within society. And so only by kind of analyzing and understanding these forces, and well, I'll say this, it can seem kind of futile at times to resist it. It seems almost inevitable. But by looking at kind of historical examples of oppression and resistance, we're hoping to build kind of a agency in the students and an understanding that they can take action and affect change that will hopefully help to, well, not say solve this problem, but at least make a dent in the problem that we're here focusing on today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kelly.
Okay, and one of the great things about doing a learning community like this is that we get to explore both historically marginalized groups and talk about the ways that they resisted and dealt with their situation. But also we have a lot more time, so we can delve into more current examples in contemporary society of how marginalized groups deal with their positions of marginalization. And hopefully get the students to see that there's some similarities and some parallels there. And so I teach a lot of historical examples of that, being slaves or women or factory workers, but we also like to bring in contemporary examples. So one of the great things about the learning community is it gives you a little bit more space and more time to explore those issues, and you can kind of develop and go into depth on them a lot, in a lot more, in a complex way. So what I'm going to talk to you briefly about, yeah, you can do the PowerPoint, is James C. Scott's work. How many of you know who James C. Scott is? Okay, not too many people. He is, I learned about him in graduate school. So I will say this, do not assign his work to your students. It won't work, trust me. In fact, this is a very dense book, and it'll take you a while to absorb it. But if you can relate to your students in an understandable way, the message behind it is pretty simple. Okay? So James C. Scott is a political scientist and anthropologist at Yale University. His work was originally done with peasant rebellions. He was interested in peasant revolutions and rebellions, specifically in Southeast Asia. What does that have to do with the United States? Well, some of his observations were developed into theories about how marginalized groups resist. What he found in his work with peasant rebellions is, this is not very interesting or relevant because peasant rebellions are rare, and successful peasant rebellions are even rarer, right? So what he thought is, but everyday forms of resistance, that's something we should be focusing on because it's there that rebellions germinate. right? In these everyday forms of resistance. And those theories, and why we used his work is because I think that it can be applied in different time periods to different societies and across disciplines, right? So you can use these fundamental ideas to examine power dynamics, not just in history or in English, but certainly in philosophy and a lot of other disciplines, right? Let me just explain two of his kind of pieces of work and how we used what came out of those books in our class. His kind of seminal work, after he was looking at peasant rebellions, he did a book on weapons of the weak, right? It's called Weapons of the Weak, Everyday Forms of Peasant Resistance. So what do you think a weapon of the, give me an example of a weapon of the weak.
Numbers.
Farm implements.
Okay, let's go back for numbers. Can you explain that?
Numbers in the amount of people.
Okay.
Striking,
It's typically
boycott.
the larger group.
Okay, the larger groups tend to be the more oppressed groups. Okay, let me get some other suggestions.
I thought you meant in a more literal sense. I was thinking farm implements.
Okay, okay. I'll give you a clue. He doesn't mean literal weapons, right? So they are more ideological weapons.
Desperation?
Boycotts and strikes?
Strikes,
A little less. See, the problem with marginalized groups is if they are obvious in their protest, they get crushed, right? So think about ways you can resist your experience as a marginalized group subtly.
Slowdowns.
Work slowdowns, dragging your foot. The classic example is you're mean to your waiter, and the waiter has to be nice to you. So they go back and take your order, and what do?
Spit in.
Right. Now they bring that out to you. Now, do they tell you I just spit in your soup?
No.
No, they can't, because to do that would mean you would complain about them. But they don't tell you, they walk away. Now, does that change their position of subordination?
No.
No, but do they feel better about it?
Yes.
Probably. They go home thinking, I got that person right. Those are the kind of things that James C. Scott was investigating. How do marginalized groups every day resist their subordination? And it can be a little bit more over work slowdowns as long as you don't single yourself out and get caught. Sabotage as long as you don't get caught. Right? These little, and so those were weapons of the weak. They were ideological weapons that, again, didn't change necessarily the power dynamics, but made people able to cope with their situation, right? So that was his first book. And we do a lot of examining weapons of the weak, right? In our history, certainly in history. The other book, and kind of the book that is a foundation for the course as we examine these power relations, is his second one, which I have and I'll pass around, is called Domination and the Arts of Resistance, right? Now here, what he was wanting to look at is the power dynamics and how both elite and subordinated groups interact both publicly and interact with each other behind the scenes, right? So I'm going to move now to show you, and now so this is the theoretical foundation. As you explain it to your students, you would want to do this slowly and over time, but you can see it's not that hard to get. It's not that hard to understand what people, I bet your students could come up with a million examples of the way that they got back at their boss, right? One of the things James C. Scott talks about in these peasant villages was rumors. They would talk about the wife, which would really get her because she didn't know where the rumor was coming from, right? So these little ways, right? So we have two groups, and James C. Scott is not a Marxist. However, his theories are grounded in class struggle. Maybe he's a neo-Marxist. His theories are grounded in class struggle, which means he necessarily kind of divides the world into two groups, right? And maybe it's a little simplistic, but I think we're all here today because we understand this dynamics is very much at play in contemporary society, right? We have subordinated groups. Now they can be, for our purposes, because the conference is focusing on economic inequality. In the class we talk about economic inequality and marginalization, but also racial marginalization and inequality and things. But we're going to use the example of economic marginalization, right? So we have two groups, subordinated groups and elite groups. Now, there are two types of transcript, and he calls these transcripts kind of discourses, right? The ways in which groups talk about each other and talk to each other, right? Those are transcripts. So if you think literal transcript, sometimes they are literal. They write them down and we have evidence of that. Sometimes not so literal, right? Hidden transcripts are those transcripts that the subordinated groups share with each other away from the elite, okay? So give me an example of what two minimum wage fast food workers might be saying to each other away from their boss or away from, what are they saying?
What a greedy old bastard.
Give me McDonald's made billions of dollars and they're paying us minimum wage. I mean, they complain about it, right? Factory workers in the 1830s and 1840s, the mill girls complained bitterly about their, really harsh conditions. But they did that to each other because if they complained to the boss or anybody else, what would be done?
Fired.
They'd be fired, right? So they can't let these hidden transcripts out. Now, elites also have hidden transcripts, and that's the thing that James C. Scott wants you to understand. It's not just marginalized groups that have these transcripts. Elite groups are talking to each other behind closed doors, right? And they're pretty open about what they're doing, right? Let me try to get you to give me an example of one of a case of this happened in, when was the last presidential election? 2012, right? One of the candidates, and now these transcripts are not supposed to be
47%, right.
public.
Yeah.
They're not supposed to be public, but every once in a while,
Yeah.
you get caught on tape. And what did Min Romney say when he was on tape?
47% will never vote for this.
Right off 47% of the public.
Never
They're takers.
They're teachers,
right?
yes.
Now, was that supposed to get out?
Nope.
Because when it did, it exposed what the elites, what did Min Romney say in public about the people? We respect your opinion. We want to help the middle class,
Right.
We want to help you succeed. So these hidden transcripts, again, are supposed to stay hidden, right, in both cases. Now, if we get to the more public transcripts, right, so these are transcripts that are in public. These two groups are in conversation with each other, and there are a couple of different ways that subordinated groups, a couple of different types of public transcripts. The public ones that are open, so let me give you an example of this, and maybe you can help me think of a couple more. These are public discourses in which the subordinated groups display deference to the system, right? That there's nothing much we can do about it. We even, they're very patriotic, and they accept, right, the situation. My favorite contemporary example of this is at the airport. You have a regular ticket to get on the airplane, right? But the airlines is a great example of our class system, because who gets in line first? The rich people. Who gets the good seats?
Rich people.
And then you have to walk by them kind of in shame, right? And so, but we defer to that. I'm not going to say, hey, why does he get to go first? I got a ticket just like him. I understand. He paid more, he gets to go first. He paid more, he gets the better seat, right? There's a certain amount of deference to that system, right? We recognize it and respect it for what it is. Or maybe not respect it, but accept it for what it is. Labor Day is a perfect example, right? We celebrate every year Labor Day. Not on the correct month, but we do celebrate Labor Day. We exalt the workers of America, the laboring classes. But in a way, that's a farce, because we have public officials who then turn around and talk about, labor thugs. I defeated the labor thugs, right? Meaning labor unions, right? Mm-hmm. So there are certain public displays, and a lot of these are ritualistic, patriotic days, holidays and stuff, in which the subordinated classes defer to that system. But, and here's what we get the students to start thinking about. Embedded in some of these public displays of deference are hidden transcripts, critiques of power, right, that are somewhat veiled. We'll talk about sometimes they can be pretty not veiled, but especially those veiled ones that are meant to publicly kind of defer, but in a way that's ideologically insubordinate, right? I'm going to give you an example of this. One of the ways we can look for these, and you can get students to think about these, is have them examine music, art, poetry. These are the ways that subordinated classes critique power. And if they want to be careful about it, especially if you look at societies that have more repressive regimes, they're pretty clever about it. Okay, I'm going to play you an example, and we're going to look at that example. And to listen, you may know the song, probably most of you do. But the lyrics will come up, and then we'll talk about how this was a kind of a veiled critique, right? What's that? Let's just play it. I think, no, yeah, I'm on stop. Well, can help me. Oh, there we go. If you didn't have feelings of patriotism, this song didn't just. I mean, this song is a very patriotic song.
Yes.
Patriotic song,
It
right?
should be the national anthem.
Well, and if we look at who, and the problem with this is we don't see it as so veiled anymore. But it was veiled enough, in fact, for George Bush to use it in his presidential campaign in 1988.
Well,
He should
that
fire
says a
that
lot.
guy but no, I mean, if the elite can use this song, and if we know anything about Guthrie, he certainly was pretty far left and had a real strong critique of the social structure and the economic system, right? But if you read it and you didn't know anything about Guthrie or anything, it doesn't sound necessarily threatening, right? It doesn't sound like a harsh critique, right? Certainly not like some songs that come out, Public Enemy and some of the more harsh critiques of the system. So these are this is what James C. Scott was talking about. Veiled critiques of the system, embedded to let subordinate classes it's an ideological insubordination, right? Can anyone think of any other examples, maybe, of veiled critiques?
No, I was just thinking about that song, and if you look back at what elementary schools were teaching, they didn't have the kids sing everything that was in that song.
No, you're right, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were a lot smarter than Bush's campaign, apparently. But so just to use some historical examples that I bring into my class with regard to slavery and African American society, there's a whole host of African spirituals and songs that were veiled critiques of the system. And in fact, the African spiritual slaves would be out in the field singing these Christian songs, and slave owners would be patting themselves on the back, thinking that we've Christianized these heathens and they understand their place, unaware that African Americans had appropriated a lot of that language and the stories in Christianity and used them for their own purposes, especially if we get to, so we assigned a book about Nat Turner's rebellion, and Nat Turner had a very different view of Christianity than his slave owner, right? Leading him to start a revolt that didn't end well, but so that's and what we do in classes, we try to get students to think about and maybe go home and look around and figure out, read poetry, find music, bring it into class and share these kind of veiled critiques, right? Because what James C. Scott argued is this is where formal resistance germinates. It's here that you see the places where you organize for change, and it's here that it's built around these informal types of protests, right? The other thing is that elite groups also have their public transcripts, right? So elite groups, especially let's take elected officials, they need to convince the public they both care about the regular voter and are interested for their welfare, right? And it's important that those elite remain united, right? And that their hidden transcripts stay hidden. And these kind of things would be, euphemistic. James C. Scott uses the example of under totalitarian regimes, re-education camps. Mm-hmm. You can look at contemporary society and see the way they talk about firing people. What do they say? We're not going to fire 400 people. We're going to what? Downsize.
Make redundant in England. Made redundant.
Made redundant, that's what they call it.
Whoa.
Wow. Yeah.
Wow.
So these kind of euphemisms that that are meant to mask the real brutality of what they're doing, right? And they employ these in a way that makes them at least look like they care about the interests of society, and it's not them. In other words, as Daniel was saying, this inequality that exists is not created, it just happens.
Yeah.
Right? This kind of fundamental theory is what we try to teach the students, and then we try to get them to apply it. Again, in history, we might look at marginalized genders, women. We will look at marginalized racial groups, African Americans, or we can look at economic marginalization, right? So that's how we use his theories. Yeah.
This is really great for manufacturing industries. How do you bring this into contemporary economics with so much outsourcing and freelancing? I'm just thinking about a piece that was done last night on NPR about all this freelance stuff, because I think that's the piece. If you want the students, I think part of what you're doing is also doing political awareness.
Yeah.
And so I love it. I think it's great, but it's old economy. It's not current economy. I'm wondering if you've been able to update that yet.
Yeah, I guess I would differ with you a little bit in that when you talk about the ways elite groups market what's happening,
Yeah.
it's right here, right? They have to market these ways that they do things in a way that's politically, that people don't recognize it for what it is.
And I agree with you on that. I'm talking more on the other side. That's the piece, to create that awareness. Because, I see the students, I'm going to be a freelancer. I'm going to...
They buy into these ideas. I'm going to work for Uber and make a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
Well, of course, that's a harder thing, and I think that's what we find in all of our classes, is it gets them to see how some of the things that they think are pretty benign are actually part of the system. And I guess I can only answer you by saying that our job is to first get students to understand power dynamics. And James C. Scott has been criticized for his materialism and his reductionism, but I find it still very relevant. And certainly, we can critique that kind of reductionist thinking, but at the end of the day, we see it happening. It's just the elites have become so much better at masking that, right? We're going to take questions, but I want to turn it over to Daniel because he's going to go through some of the things we did in class, and these are a few things that no matter what the discipline is, you can employ in your class, and then we can come back around to talking about these harder issues that.
All right, so as I mentioned before, it's a learning community with English and developmental English and history. And if you're not aware, developmental students are those who test below college readiness standards, and so they're placed into remedial or developmental courses, right? And on the topic of kind of marginalized groups, they are in many ways a marginalized group within the campus community, and that it's often kind of considered, well, they're not ready for college material. And in many ways that's not accurate. They just perhaps lack some of the basic skills needed to perform in a college class. It's not that they can't handle the concepts. And so one advantage of this learning community taken as a co-requisite is they can meet their developmental requirements while earning credit in a class, and we're able to deliver college level content with support in the English part of the class for the demands of the reading and writing within the history class. So it works well, and it allows us to kind of give them more of a traditional college experience and kind of bring them out of make them less marginalized. And Steve Davis has done a lot of work with developmental students. He'd probably agree that given the opportunity, they can, in many ways, perform. Well, they're not always the way they're painted. But anyway, so this is English or History 1301. So starting with the Spanish conquest through Reconstruction, as Professor Kelly pointed out, kind of focusing in on oppressed and marginalized groups, starting with the indigenous peoples and all the way through the end of slavery and Reconstruction. In English, quite simply, this course is to prepare them to read and write at the college level. So critical reading skills, writing skills, preparing them to write academic essays. And the great thing about teaching English is I can teach reading and writing with any kind of topic I choose, and so it's very easy for me to kind of adapt and modify my curriculum to tie in with the history course. So anyway, so I get to choose kind of reading and writing themes that one connect directly to hers, kind of her historical topics, or I'll bring in kind of similar contemporary events and issues, so we can kind of draw parallels, because I think I'm not out of line saying students today often view history as like so far past that it's completely irrelevant today, and so drawing those parallels kind of between them helps them focus in and maybe identify some of the forces that are at play today are not that different than what was before. One thing we did, kind of starting on the first day of class, and I did this. I got the role of this. So first day, got very stone-faced, stand up here and say we're going to go through the rules. And if you read through, actually, as I was creating these, I was reading them to my wife, and she's like, that doesn't sound that bad. Sounds like right? Doors will be locked at 9. You can't leave or enter or leave without permission. No food or beverages without permission. No cell phones, right? All right, so okay. Some teachers do this, sure. Talking and other forms of communication, including handwritten notes or gestures, are prohibited unless required by the instructors. Right? Dress and appearance. All right. They must be modest and appropriate by our standards, right?
So we were not laughing, they were reading
yes,
these.
the facial hair must not exceed 1/4 of an inch in length, as was recently overturned by the Supreme Court, right? So the students will read only the text approved by the instructor. No outside sources of information on our themes will be permitted. And complaints. Complaints, shared publicly or privately, will not be tolerated. Social media will be monitored. Around about this point there, their face, it was priceless. We should have photographed them at that time, because they were that. And at the end, instructors must be addressed by our titles, while they will be referred to by their student ID numbers. All right. They were disappearing into their chairs by this time.
Oh my God, what did I get myself into?
So we took this opportunity to, it was a teachable moment, right? To kind of draw parallels between the rules that we've created and the real means that a dominant group may use to maintain control and power in a society. So we're controlling their freedom of movement. We're controlling accesses to resources, right? Controlling communication. We don't want them to communicate with each other because that can be bad news for us, right? If too many of them get together, if those hidden transcripts suddenly erupt into violent protest, there are only 2 of us and 20 of them, so, right? We impose our own subjective moral values on the class with our dress code, of course. We censor them by limiting access to information. Keep them quiet. No dissent will be tolerated. And of course, we want to make sure they're aware that we are superior. We are the dominant group, and they are, in a sense, dehumanized. All right. So they felt a little better by this point when they saw that these things had a point. And then we did what's called the democratic syllabus. And so we allowed them to discuss and set policies for the class. So anything from attendance to late policies, food and beverage, cell phone policy, which is the only one. A lot of people are skeptical of giving them free rein and setting policies. The cell phone policy is the only place where I've had to exercise my dictatorial powers. They're often stricter on themselves than I would be. I have to rein them back a little bit. But this gave them the idea that, typically the classroom is a fairly oppressive setting, and there's a clear dominant group, the professor at the front of the class, and then the subordinate students. So this gives them kind of right from the first day a voice in the class. They have agency, and they can create kind of the environment that they want. And it also it gets them to think a little bit about kind of the rules and the policies. I don't know. Personally, I hate following rules, especially rules that seem arbitrary. I lived in Japan for 2 years, and the one thing that drove me crazy is they have so many rules for behavior that I could find no logical explanation for it. So something in me just revolts at that. So allowing them to kind of think about and talk through some of the issues and the policies, I think it's a lot easier to follow rules that you have a hand in creating than rules that are imposed from above. So anyway, that was kind of how we started the class. And then we get into kind of talking to them about oppression, because it's not something they think about too often. These are young students for the most part, some returning non-traditional students, but oppression is not slavery. Slavery, of course, slavery is oppression, but there's so many myriad forms of oppression. So we get them kind of brainstorming, get them thinking about oppression in U.S. history. They're usually pretty good at throwing out ideas there. And when you bring it into oppression in the U.S. today, it's probably a little more quiet, and so kind of trying to get them to draw out some thinking. And most of them don't feel oppressed in the way they define oppression, but once you get them kind of talking about it, they see how in various aspects of their lives, whether at home or at school or in their community or their church or whatever, they are in a sense oppressed. So in the course, we looked at kind of different forms of oppression, inequality based on race, ethnicity, religion, politics, socioeconomic class, all of these, and kind of they tie in with the history course. And then we look at modern day parallels as well. And one of the readings that we do is Iris Young's 5 Faces of Oppression. So we look at the different forms that it takes. Exploitation, marginalization. Violence, of course, is the one that comes to mind usually when you think of oppression, but it's much more nuanced than that, and we help draw out kind of some of these different aspects. Kind of most importantly, we wanted to get them thinking about their own lives and their own experience and how they may have kind of experienced depression. And for some, they jumped right on it. They knew. I made them write kind of one of their initial essays, just a free writing. Like, how have you experienced oppression in your life? What's made you feel oppressed, and what did you do about it? How did you resist or fight back? Or if you didn't, why not? And so we got some pretty interesting responses. Some writing about race, some writing about their family life at home. One student even talking about having Crohn's disease. And Crohn's disease was kind of an oppressive force in her life. So we wanted to make it relevant, and this is one way to make it relevant, and again, bring history out of the past and into the present day. And so perhaps more importantly for our kind of overall goal of teaching agency was looking at resistance. And as I said before, like a lot of inequality, I mean, students today that I talk to, they often kind of throw up their hands and they're either apathetic or they just kind of say, I can't do anything, there's nothing to do. And with the elections that just happened in Houston, I was talking to them about that, and there's, it doesn't matter. Whoever we elect, they're a bunch of crooks, so, you know. My vote doesn't, you know, they're kind of generally hesitant to think about it. They think of themselves as kind of powerless in many senses. So looking at different ways you can resist, what kind of options are available. And it might be direct resistance that we're most familiar with. You know, they think of Martin Luther King and, you know, people like that. But there, as Dr. Kelly pointed out, much more subtle forms of resistance that may not topple the power structure, but may serve to kind of unify the subordinate groups or give them kind of identity and purpose. So we looked at issues of what is it that compels people to risk, you know, in many cases their lives in the effort, and why are others so hesitant to do it? Why are we today so hesitant to take action when people long ago would in fact risk their lives? We risk so little in our society today to kind of stand up for and fight for what we believe. Why are we so hesitant? And one question that we return to multiple times throughout the semester is the issue of justification. Is violence justified, and if so, under what conditions? And so she talked about reading about Nat Turner. You know, we looked at political oppression in the American Revolution, and one thing that I found very interesting when I was talking about this is, okay, how many of you feel the American Revolution was justified? It was they were justified in taking up arms to fight the British government. Everyone, oh yes, unanimous. How many people thought Nat Turner was justified in taking up arms and fighting and killing slave owners? I think maybe two hesitant ones. Everyone else kept their hands down. So I was like, well, so what is it about, you know, why was he not justified yet? These early Americans were justified. What were the differences? What makes one? And it's really, as soon as you kind of point that out and make them think about it, you see them going, oh. All right. One suffering, you know, horrific treatment at the hands of slaveholders, and an entire community and people subjugated and abused and tortured and killed. The other, not so bad by comparison. Yet they automatically leap to support the revolution. So anyway, it was interesting to kind of see their thoughts on that, and see their evolution.
And you know, these are the enduring myths of the American Revolution and how and why it was justified, as opposed to other forms of resistance, right?
So these are just a few of the readings. We did do some of them, and others we've considered and may use in the future. We look all would kind of involve some kind of a marginalized or oppressed group in conflict in some ways with the dominant group. So looking at women in colonial America, slavery, what else we got?
These are some of the more kind
yeah,
of
these
lesser-known ones that
Yeah,
shorter
these were
readings.
shorter
Yeah.
pieces, but Iris Young's work, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Orwell, which is an interesting one because it's, well, he was an officer in the colonial government in Burma, so he was the oppressor. He was an arm of the British government in their colony in Myanmar, and he was forced to do something he did not want to do by the oppressed. He was forced by his role as the oppressor to go against his own values and judgment. So it's an interesting kind of twist on the standard one. But we looked at other things. Sherman Alexie's The Joys of Reading and Writing. He's a Native American contemporary author. John Brown, another interesting character. Like Nat Turner, led a slave revolt, but he was a white man. So that's an interesting kind of twist. Other news articles, so we tried to pull in modern day, events. Look at, slavery is not dead. Slavery exists in different forms all over the world. Trafficking issues, the labor issues, going back to the factory workers and the mill girls. While we don't have those same issues in our factories today, we've exported them, we've offshored them. They still exist. In many cases, just as bad as they did back then. If you look at the lives of migrant farmers in the U.S. still today, you could definitely make the argument that it is a form of slavery. It sounds like you're reading Steinbeck with the company store and becoming internally indebted to the company, and so you can't escape. So anyway, we tried to bring in kind of modern day issues, and then the songs and poems and other things of that nature. Some of the assignments that we had them do, I pulled a list of kind of quotes that looked at oppression, inequality, resistance, etc. And had them kind of analyze it, dig deep, break it down. We had them analyzing and interpreting songs, poems, or other things they identified as a hidden transcript, writing about their own personal oppression, and then kind of the goal of the course is to get them to write academic essays, and so we tied those in with the theme, either directly to the historical parts or something more modern, whatever they chose. One thing I want to point out, this was an English class and a history class, but this framework of kind of looking at the transcripts, public and hidden, is something that could be applied in many, many disciplines. Art, music, economics, political science, philosophy even, I imagine, too, whether as an overarching theme like ours was, or just as a smaller kind of snapshot within the class. So it is fairly flexible for all of these disciplines that may be looking at kind of issues of inequality and oppression and resistance. So,
And if you want, you didn't write any of that down, but you wanted it, just, you can email one of us and we'll send you the PowerPoint slides.
That's what I was thinking.
And I'm also available to any of the Lone Star professors or anybody teaching in class if you want some ideas on how to incorporate this type of thing into your class. I can talk to you about that, or share with you what we're doing on our campus at Kingwood with regard to incorporating and infusing civic engagement. Hopefully you get some ideas on this conference, but certainly email me if you would like to talk about how to either fully or even just, for one lesson incorporate.